It's a perfect pontification point just here. At all. I think what's interesting about here is if you think of this Beaumont Road here and think of the Chequers, this is ground level. This would have been the level of the original quarry. So if you think about how the land drops away either side, that's the amount of stone and materials that have been taken away from this area and deposited, well, at Windsor Castle, Eton, just down the road. I don't know how many millions of tons of stone, but it's a lot. So that's the sense of these twists and turns, these drops. I think it's really evident just here. So, kind of thinking about who the people were who first excavated this area, first settled this area. The truth is, we don't know. We don't really know who the first people were. Who were those people working for William Orchard and taking the stone out back in, the 15th and 16th century? Don't really know. There weren't many written records about that. We do know from accounts from the 17th century, there was a report in the 1630s that there were lewd and disorderly persons who despoiled the forest of brushwood. And that's really because they were talking about Shotover, and they were talking about people who were beginning to settle here, and they were rough types. Now, over the years, I've heard many kind of stories about who the original inhabitants of Quarry were. And probably the best of those is the idea they were Cornish gypsies. And that's really romantic, so I like buying into that idea. Cornish gypsies, buying into that, Romany types, and they're travelling along, and they settle here, and they excavate, and they've probably got some mining experience from tin or something down in Cornwall. Don't know. Certainly this would have been a route for gypsies, for travellers. The London Road, as I said, was over there. You had the old Roman trading route that was happening over there, from Dorchester upon Thames. And there is a big history of gypsies in this whole area. Gypsy Lane, down by Cheney School and Oxford Brooks, it's called Gypsy Lane for a reason. That's where gypsies would winter and settle. Over at the Slade, there were gypsy encampments over at the Slade on the moorland over there. I don't know if you know, if you go along the Slade, on the corner of Cinnaminter Road, there's a chip shop. If you know Cinnaminter Road, just there. Cinnaminter Road is a great exotic name. It's exotic because it's the name of a gypsy princess. So, Princess Cinnaminter. So, there was a strong connection just there. And here, even my grandmother would tell me stories about gypsies would winter here regularly. In Mason's, behind the Mason's pub, as she would say, proper gypsies in old proper caravans. They would winter here. Gypsies would turn up and they would put on fairs in the Mason's yard. Certainly there were gypsies living in Pitts Road, where the garage is now. That was a gypsy encampment just there. Plenty of stories about that. So gypsies were welcomed here. And they certainly weren't treated with any degree of suspicion here. Whether it was Cornish gypsies or not, I don't know. Although I'll give you a little bit of a twist of that at the end of the tour. But what we do know is that people started to settle here in the 17th century. They really started to settle here in the 19th century, which is a bit strange, really, because really by the 19th century, these pits were not being used commercially anymore. Things really changed for the industry here, because when people found out that the freestone was fairly poor stone, didn't last very long, it was less attractive, the hard stone wasn't that plentiful and it was hard to get at, and then in the 18th century the canals came, and the canals meant that stone could be floated in to the centre of Oxford, at the bottom of Worcester Street, Park End Street. Park End Street was one big canal wharf. Where Nuffield College is built, that is the infilled canal wharf just there. So materials were floated into the centre of town. One little nice story, not really related, but it gives you an idea about how the canals changed Oxford, is that Park End Street is so named because there was a coal yard there, and it took coal from Gloucestershire, from the Park End Colliery in Gloucestershire. So Park End Street is called Park End Street because that's where the coal was coming from. It was floated along the canals to Gloucestershire. So that changed everything. So by the time of the 19th century, that's not to say the pits weren't completely exhausted, they weren't. Magdalen Pit, which is the pit behind Henderson Community Centre. You can still see it. It's a nature reserve. That was still being exploited up until 1949. It wasn't shut till then. But the stone then wasn't being used for like high-end purposes. It was being used for sewers. It was being used for cesspits. It was being used for odds and sods jobs. Really, it wasn't the high end. It wasn't the high masonry stuff that had been used back, a few centuries previously. So people turned up here, and to give you an example of how the population swelled, in 1841 census there were about 250 people living here. In the 1901 census there were 1,500 people living here. So it was a big explosion. Why did they come here? It's hard now to kind of imagine what this area would have looked like, because now it's a very leafy, nice, desirable area. It's not a cheap place to live anymore. Back then it was a very, very cheap place to live, and a very, I would say, undesirable place to live. The old pit workings would have been flooded. The old pit roads were just gravel, muddy roads. There was no sewerage here. You didn't get running water here until 1913. This was an outlying area. It was rough. Also, as well, what had happened in the intervening time, I don't know if, anyway, those maps are still out there, but in the intervening time is a workhouse had been constructed. So where Trafford Road is, the development there was a workhouse there. There were also brickworks. So the quarries may have shut, but there were brickworks. You can see there was a brickworks up at Kill Lane. There was 2 brickworks up at Titup, not far from where the reservoir is. So you had a disused industrial area, flooded pits, no running water, dirty tracks, dirty brickworks all the way either side, and yet people were flocking here to set up house. I think there were many reasons why they did that. Nobody wanted to live here, so what there was here was plentiful land. So what people would do is they would turn up in Quarry, they would find a piece of land, and they would kind of fence it off, and they would start farming it, and they might build a house there. That's why in subsequent decades, a lot of people found that when they came to sell their houses, there were no deeds for it, because essentially people came here and they squatted the land. It was free. Wasn't free land, but well, yeah, it was free land actually. They came and they took it. Now, I'd suggest to you that does invite a certain type of person. It would attract a certain type of individual. Rugged individualism, chancers, ne'er-do-wells, all of those sorts of things. Quarry was still, even in the 19th century, a very isolated place. Green fields all around. There's no Risinghurst, there's no New Headington, there's Old Headington, but essentially it's ringed by green fields. It's isolated. If you wanted to disappear, if you're a bit dodgy, a little bit woo, a little bit wah, this was a great place to come and turn up. Also as well, you think of this area, this is a small area, and really, as they would have done, they would have included Titup really within this area, within the Quarry area. There were 4 pubs. There were 4 pubs for about 1,000 people. Bearing in mind that before the Second World War, women didn't go into pubs in this area, it was just for men. A lot of thirsty men here, The other thing that was attractive about this area is that whereas Old Headington was a bit more upmarket, shall we say, and there were rich people here, there were no rich people here. There was no lord of the manor here. There was no person to be beholden to. There was no person to be grateful for. There was no person who was organising things for you. It was fairly anarchic. If you turned up here, it was a huge, big, working class community. And out of that, what started to happen was this idea that they were self-governing, autonomous. It sounds a bit like the mafia, because it was a bit like the mafia. They were running things for themselves. Now that becomes very seductive, I think, for a lot of people. So you hear terms about people around here were clannish, they were insular, they were suspicious of strangers. They were all of those things because they were doing dodgy things. There was Shotover was just up there. These roads would have just led straight into Shotover. No bypass, no Risinghurst. Plenty of poaching to be done up there. And like I say, no lord of the manor. The cottages over there, if you walk past the cottages over there, you will see on the side there is a plaque that says Manor House. Now, For many years, I used to walk past there and think, manor house, that is somebody who's bought that building and they thought, right, I'm going to, because there was no manor here, there was no gentry here at all. And I thought that was somebody who put that on the side and they were a bit, you know, trying to put a few quid on the house, but called it Quarry Manor House. Turns out that's not true. It was actually a guy called John Coppock, the Coppock family again. He was a bricklayer. He bought those 2 cottages and moved his family in there, and he called it Quarry Manor as a joke. It was like a joke that there was no manor here. And actually, his view as described, he would have looked out where those houses are there was a pit. He'd have looked out onto rubbish, onto just a desolate idea. So it was actually a tongue-in-cheek joke with his mates to say, yeah, I live in the manor. And they said, yeah, of course you do. So you start to have this explosion of people, and you start to maybe get the seeds of this sort of individualism, this idea that this was, and it was really a purely working class community. If you look at the census records, very few people had servants here. Hardly any people had servants. The vicar had some servants, but ordinary people did not have servants. The other thing, although they took in washing from the university, very snooty about working at the university. They didn't fancy that at all. They didn't like doing that. Also as well, the workhouse is just up here. It's called the Laurels. Long gone now, or there's still people who remember it. Lynn and Keith in Pitts Road still remember that, my old neighbours, they still remember the Laurels. Horrible, desolate place, as Lynn said. Interestingly enough, if you look at the people who were in the workhouse, very few people from Quarry were actually in the workhouse. It was outsiders who were being brought in. So you get the basis of this very kind of self-sufficient, slightly insular community. We'll walk on now to the 6 Bells.